Hi, welcome to the Trauma Thrivers podcast. Delighted to have you with us. I'm Lula Bentz, your host, a psychotherapist, a trauma expert, and a survivor myself. Lovely to have you with us. The Trauma Thrivers podcast is for anybody who has been through any sort of developmental trauma or who has complex PTSD. This podcast aims to help educate, inspire, and support those of us that are on a trauma healing journey. We've got stories, steps, and various solutions to trauma to help you heal. If you'd like more information or tips or tools or strategies, please go to traumathrivers.com. You can also find this podcast on my YouTube channel, Lula Bentz Trauma Thrivers. If you'd like to join our community of thrivers, please find us on Facebook under Trauma Thrivers. Hello, Trauma Thrivers. Welcome. Lovely to be back. I know that we haven't been here for a while on a Thursday evening, so I hope some of you are joining us live. And if you're not, please do watch it afterwards, because I'm really grateful, honoured and touched to have a very dear friend with us this evening who I was trying to work out, Fred, how long it is that we've known each other for the other day. I was wondering whether you might remember.
I think it's probably about 12 years is my guess.
Is it? I thought it might be slightly longer ago than that even.
Well, I suppose it could be a little bit longer than that. I mean, I think I started working at the Priory and joined when you were already there.
Yes, you did.
About 2008 or something.
Yeah, so it felt to me about 2008 because...
So, yeah, so that's about 15 years, isn't it?
Yeah, I was going to say it's about 15 years. So for those of you tuning in, Freddie and I have known each other for 15 years, and I was delighted to work with you at the Priory. I know it sounds funny, but it was always a joy to go in when you were there. And we just didn't get enough time together. I didn't feel. I don't know who left first, but I seem to remember that you might have gone off first. But before we go into that, I wonder whether you'd mind just saying a bit about who you are and your background and how you got into the Priory in the first place and how we ended up working together.
Yes, thanks, Lee. Well, firstly, it is so lovely to be here. I feel very honoured to have been asked, and really enjoying getting to catch up with you.
Finally, we got there.
We're doing it, so that's great. And well, I'm a integrative counsellor. I sort of came into the therapy world through the addiction masters, which I did, which I know a lot of our colleagues did at the time.
Yeah.
And of course that came out of my own sort of recovery history and my own healing crisis, which happened quite early on for me in my
How
journey.
old were you, Fred? Do you mind me? I'm trying to remember. I know that I did know a bit of your story, but unfortunately after 15 years, sometimes I need to be a bit reminded. Maybe it's because we hear quite a lot of stories, so it's the retention of them. Yeah,
we sure do. So yeah, I suppose about the age of 19 or so, I sort of, my health failed, and I kind of ended up leaving university and just being kind of very, very physically ill for a few years, and not really knowing what was going on. And eventually, through many serendipitous things and effortful things, and after a lot of pain, realizing that I had an eating disorder, realizing that there was a lot of historical trauma and unprocessed emotion that had been driving all of that. and this physical dysfunction, chronic fatigue syndrome, and so on.
Okay.
And so then I got into recovery when I was about 22.
Yeah,
I was very lucky.
That's really young, isn't it? That's amazing.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
I mean, it was so weird at the time because, you know, on the one hand, it was, you know, the best thing ever because I'd been in such misery for quite a few years already. But it was kind of weird because all of my contemporaries at the time were, you know, just having fun, enjoying life, getting on with it, you know. And there was me having to do this incredibly intense, you know, emotional and psychological work on myself. But as it turns out, that's something that suits me. And I'm sort of endlessly fascinated. And, you know, no doubt that experience has sort of created a huge interest and empathy for other people's suffering and desire to understand and support other people on their journey as well, whilst I continue on my own.
Exactly. Don't we all? We're all works in process, I say, or progress, is it?
Right.
So at 22, did you then start training, or did you go into treatment? What was the kind of first pointer for you? How did you get your initial help?
Yeah. I was lucky, I think. I think my physical symptoms were so severe that I just couldn't escape the need to work on myself. Okay. You know, there was no other way out of it. And I used to lie in bed. I had this really bad chronic fatigue syndrome and insomnia at the same time. And I was just sort of, it was like being kind of incarcerated in your body or something.
Yeah.
It was horrible, you know, for months and indeed years. And I used to lie there, and I used to have this picture in my mind that sort of sustained me, where I was striding across mountainsides, and at the time I didn't recognize the relevance of that at all. But it's something that, you know, as I've gone on in my journey and nature has sort of played such a big role in it, that that somehow, you know, I think it was always there. And but to answer your question, I you know, I had about a year of denial, of just, you know, waiting for something to change, of just complete and utter bafflement and severe depression, and you know, and eventually losing hope. And of course, it was at that point, that moment, where I became open, where I let go, because I thought that I couldn't get better, and that was it. And where suddenly grace could enter and something new could happen. And so on a kind of spiritual level, I suppose I started to really engage with the idea of healing and the idea of wholing. And I got into meditation and yoga and all these practices that started to give me some agency again, and awaken my body and awaken indeed my emotions. But the problem is that I didn't have any of the practical tools or the psychological understanding for how to cope with any of that stuff.
Yeah,
so
sure.
It just precipitated even more distress, at the same time as knowing that I was kind of moving in the right direction. It was also really scary. And then I realized that disorder, and that what created a lot of the physical symptoms or contributed to them. And so what to resume a normal relationship with food simply by my own efforts and my own willpower. Lucky to encounter a doctor, a GP who was in.
Fred, we're just losing the connection a bit, actually. So we're losing, sadly, some of what you're saying. Oh, we've lost Freddie. Oh,
Lou,
he's back.
I'm back.
He's back. He's sideways, but he's back.
Yeah, let me bring myself back
We
the right
kind of
way.
lost you at the point that you were talking about the eating disorder and finding the GP, really.
Okay. So he was in recovery himself, and he was able to point me towards a place that would actually give me those practical tools to get the behavioral elements that could support me to get my health back, and to start to sort of balance out my nervous system a little bit and regulate, and be in a group of other people who are doing the same thing, get all that identification, reduce all the shame that I had and the complete and utter bafflement about what on earth was going on. And yeah, so I sort of got into recovery that way. And
did you use the 12 steps? I know that we've got a few people watching, so if anybody wants to ask any questions or comment or say anything or join in, please do, because I'm sure Freddie would be very open to any questions that come up for you as you're watching this. But I guess I'm wondering, what were the tools that helped you regulate? And did you use a therapist, or did you get a therapist early on, or somebody helping you? What kind of was the jump between that early recovery and identification? And was that mainly 12-step work, or was it something else that you found helpful? Just if anybody's in your position now that might be watching this.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lou. So, I mean, I was very fortunate to be able to go to a rehabilitation center where I'd get that practical support around the relationship with food specifically.
Yeah.
And I got the psychoeducation to understand what a normal portion was. I got the emotional support to challenge all of those, really tricky and demanding thought processes that would keep telling me that I should not eat so much, or that, whatever it was. And I had a lot of group therapy at that time. And I also did get introduced to the 12 steps, and that became the support network that I used sort of moving forwards. But I was always interested in other things that would support me as well. And so I was using meditation, although there was a period of time where actually I stepped back from it because I was at a stage where I couldn't utilize it. I would just get trapped in my own thinking rather than it being useful. So I think that it's good for us to kind of modulate our exposure to some of those techniques according to what our capacity is at the time.
Yeah, I agree with you totally.
Yeah, and really keeping it simple.
Yeah.
So yeah, and what else did I do? I did get a therapist.
Yeah.
Continued utilizing that support, and as you know, Lou, and anyone else listening who's a therapist, it just basically becomes a way of life, doesn't it? It's sort of, it's part of our ongoing education as much as anything to continue exploring stuff, and that's sort of been the case for me. And
then I guess at some point you decided you felt well enough, or you got to a point where you felt well enough to train. What was that shift like for you?
Well, I went off and sort of adventured for a while. I mean,
did you?
Because
you like your adventures, don't you? Because I want to come back to the adventure post the Priory in a minute. But I always think of you as being very adventurous. What was your adventure at that moment? What did you do?
Well, I went and lived in Australia, actually.
Did you? I didn't know that about you. Wow.
I was there for 2 years.
Oh my God. Wow.
I had an amazing time. It was really amazing. But before that, I think because of the stage I was at, I hadn't entered the world before I got really ill. And so, my parents suggested I might go back into education and finish off my degree that I've been trying to do. And that would have in many ways been a sensible thing to do. But but I just felt like, no, I just want to live. You know, I'm not ready to choose what I'm going to study or anything like that. I've just discovered myself for the
Yeah,
first time in many ways, you know. And
amazing.
so much of my healing and so much of that kind of reclaiming myself was about, you know, letting go of societal and, you know, conventional expectations, and actually following my intuition and what my own innate knowing was telling me about what I was interested in and what I was here to do and what my skills were, and all that sort of thing. So I went off and did music for a while and worked in, you know, record companies and
Oh, great.
studios and stuff like that. And that's what I was doing in Australia.
Yeah.
But what I realized whilst I was out there was that I was actually more interested and more engaged and captivated by the emotional dynamics in the recording studio than, you know,
I can
how
imagine. I
how
can
to
imagine.
operate.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was the point at which I decided, okay, you know, this is what I seem to be most interested in life,
Yeah.
and this is what I'm going to do.
Wow. And is that when you did the MSc in addiction and psychology? Is it at King's? Yeah.
It was a London South Bank
Yeah.
University.
Okay. Yeah.
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 And yeah, so I kind of came back and I thought, well, I don't quite know what I'll do. And I knew I wanted to do something to help people. I didn't know quite how or what. And so I just got in touch with the old treatment center where I'd been, and I said, can I come and, you know, see what it's like to be a counselor? And they were like, yeah, sure, come and check it out.
How
And they
brilliant.
were just so helpful and sort of welcoming, and they have a real tradition there of kind of giving you a leg up, and that's exactly what they did. And they sort of trained me, and I worked there, and then a few years later, that's when we met, when I joined you at the Priory.
Okay. And we were there together for a while, and then I remember being totally disappointed and saddened by the fact that you were leaving. But
off on another adventure.
Yeah, off on another adventure. So this was a walking adventure. So this is the kind of, feels to me like this was the link between then and your journey and learning and training into more of what you're doing now. So can you bring not just me, but all of us up to speed with how this evolved?
Absolutely, thanks. So yeah, whilst living in London, working at the Priory, I knew that I wasn't really cut out for urban living. And, you know, I would find myself quite stimulated, my whole nervous system quite stimulated by the urban environment. And, but I was really enjoying working there. And I sort of, you know, wanted to deepen my experience and all of that. And so I didn't want to just sort of disappear. So I decided to kind of stay on, but I felt this incredibly deep longing, you know, to be immersed in the natural world. And I remember taking some time off over the summer. I was at Priory for about 2 years, and I took some time off after about a year.
That's right.
And I went walking up in Scotland, and I ended up sort of walking the St Cuthbert's Way, which goes from Melrose down the River Tweed, right on the borders between England and Scotland, and through these beautiful hills called the Cheviot Hills, and then down to the North Sea, to across this amazing causeway, which you can only cross when the tide is out, across to Lindisfarne, which is this holy island where, you know, which is the sort of center of Christianity in
I'm getting goosebumps you talking about it. Yeah.
And, you know, it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. I felt a sense of kind of engagement with the world that I hadn't felt for a long time. And when I got to that final destination, it had been about a week, I remember just feeling immense grief at having to stop and having to go back to, life as usual and life in the city and so on. And so the seed was planted, and it took a little bit of courage to make the decision to go for it. And
loads.
In fact, I remember I went to visit my brother who was in Nicaragua, and whilst I was sitting in a cafe, in the middle of nowhere, I mean, this is, kind of some random traveler's haunt, I just picked up a book off the shelf, and it was called Pelican in the Wilderness. And it was a history of recluses, mystics, and, something else. And basically it was this random book all about this venerable history of wandering and pilgrimage and kind of nature immersion and things over the ages. And it was just like this little gem of a book that gave me a kind of like a sense of context. It's like, no, it may be a bit countercultural, it may be a bit unusual, it may be a bit hard for people to understand why you might want to do this, but in fact there are other people who have wanted to do this and have greatly benefited from it, so go for it. So that's when I decided to leave, and I knew I wanted to do what I had done before, but do it, to a much deeper and fuller extent.
Yeah.
And so I decided to walk west.
That's right.
Yeah. From Hammersmith up the river. And it's amazing how quickly the Thames River becomes a place of beauty and wilderness. I mean, I couldn't believe it. It wasn't even a day before I was in a place of remarkable beauty.
Where did you get to? Can you remember where that place of beauty was, just out of interest?
I can't, but there are various islands that have sort of, had historical relevance. In fact, there's one where I can't remember what it was called, but there was a recording studio in the Stones, and people had kind of back in the day. But as I walked along there, one of the things that I realized is that even though we're in an urban environment, actually the beauty of nature is very, very often really close and really accessible. It's just about knowing where to go and making the effort to kind of search the place out.
Yeah.
So that was a good lesson. And then I just continued west, and I knew I wanted to go west, and I didn't know where exactly, but I just sort of submitted myself to the adventure.
Where did you end up in the end?
I ended up at Land's End.
Okay, that's right.
And when I got to Land's End, I looked out and I saw the Scilly Isles, and I think, well, I've got to go there. and actually, that was a perfect example of not knowing when to stop, because I just got really sick on the ferry journey over there, and then came back, and actually I'd done enough. I'd gone far enough, and that was the moment where I needed to integrate the experience.
Yeah.
And just to say a little bit about it. I had undertaken that journey with a kind of sense of needing to find some kind of internal anchor in myself. And, I had done, as you know, I'd done a lot of therapy by that time. I'd done a lot of work on myself. I had great awareness of where some of the origins of my stuff had come from. But I hadn't been able to get to a point where there was enough grounding and enough connection and sort of solidity in myself to be able to tolerate the challenge of relationship.
Yep.
And I wanted to be able to be in relationship and to sustain the terror for me of that, and the confusion of that.
Yeah.
but I just had this sort of knowing that something needed to shift within me before that happened, and I felt really drawn to the natural world as a place to support me to do that. And indeed, that happened. Something shifted in terms of my internal connection with myself, and it's very hard to articulate exactly what that was, but it was the sense of some kind of anchor that went down from within me. Actually, it was as if my kind of energetic body was able to open to the support of the earth.
Beautiful.
And up until that point, and I think that this is where maybe I can kind of say a little bit about eco-psychology and
yeah, that would be lovely, because it's fascinating, I think, for all of us, how this came in and how it became grounded in you to then take out and deliver to us.
Well, yes, so up until that point, like I said, the kind of therapeutic modalities I had encountered had made such a phenomenal difference to my life, and really done what was needed. But to go that next piece, something else was needed, and I'm so encouraged to see within the trauma field now our understanding of the somatic dimension recovery. But I think that was still sort of very much coming through at the time, and I tried a bit of body psychotherapy, but somehow it just hadn't landed with me. It hadn't particularly. I'd done a bit of somatic experiencing, but somehow it just hadn't quite sort of done what I needed it to do. And I think because the nature of my trauma, wasn't something sort of discrete and specific. It was that deep kind of developmental sort of lack that had been there, and that had created this kind of perpetual sense of fear, of energetic contraction within my physical body, and and the low self-esteem patterns and shame, all of that stuff. And because it wasn't like one thing that had happened, it was much more attachment based, and I've since discovered pre-verbal birth trauma, potentially in utero as well, and it's been a fascinating journey to sort of get to all of that, but because of that, it was like widening the frame from trying to get healing simply through the human relational dimension, and actually allowing it to come from the greatest sphere of existence in which we all live, and psychology has emerged from Western thought, and like all of Western thought, it's coming from our own cultural paradigm. And as we know at the moment, we're in a paradigm that is not able to recognize the interdependence of all things, and indeed our dependence upon the living systems of the earth. If we did recognize that, we would not be destroying it, and actually undermining our existence at the same time. There's still a separation that's there within our consciousness, that's enabling us to continue perpetuating essentially this trauma on the very system that we depend upon. So yes, for me, there's been an element of actually coming back into relationship with the natural world, and that's not an exclusion of the human world. The human world is part of the natural world, and human relationship is vital. And even if I go on a deep wilderness experience where I go and have some kind of rite of passage out in the wild, and and encounter all sorts of mysterious dimensions of myself within the canvas of nature. The thing that makes it relevant and translatable into my life is being able to process it with other human beings.
Yeah.
And I land it in the body, land it in my understanding of myself and my relationships and where I am in the world. And so, you know, this is not about kind of trying to replace the human dimension with some kind of fabled, idealistic, you know, nature existence. But it's about trying to actually just set the human dimension back into the context of the container of the natural world around it.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. And it makes a lot of sense because, you know, there is that spiritual element of connectivity to all of our journeys, isn't there? Through our wiser, I mean, you know, there's so many words for it, that I was doing a podcast last week on non-duality, and it's like, what's the self? What's I? What do you mean by that phrase? What do you mean by, and I suppose trying to put it into context for me to understand it is that we are connected to all living things, not just human beings. We are held in a container, or if you like, or a soup of other things that can balance us or can reground us, or can, whether it's Mother Earth or nature, or whether it's our dogs or our animals or our tables and chairs, everything is, we have a relationship with everything, don't we? And I know that you did quite a lot of study in indigenous cultures where, you know, the first thing that they seem to do that a lot of the West don't do is they respect the earth and the planet and the trees and the animals and everything else, because to be healthy, maybe like with all parts of ourselves, we need to live in unity with them.
Absolutely. You've reminded me of a quote which I wanted to bring in, where, you know, even within the realms of sort of conventional psychology, that there is very much the acknowledgement, you know, of this loss and of the extraordinary wealth of nature and the wilderness, and how impoverished we are if we no longer have any connection with it. And Jung, for example, wrote, "No voices now speak to man from stones, plants and animals, nor does he speak to them, believing they can hear. His contact with nature has gone, and with it has gone the profound emotional energy that this symbolic connection supplied." So, you know, that's just one recognition. But you're absolutely right when you say that eco-psychology and, you know, I think sort of more recent nature-based therapies have been greatly influenced by indigenous knowing and practice, which, you know, much of it has existed within the context of a reciprocal relationship with the environment, and one which maintains homeostasis. You know, there's a sort of acknowledgement of how much can be taken, and there's a giving back that happens within that as well. And one of the things that I learned whilst at Schumacher College, which is this amazing place down in Devon near where I live now, actually, which I always think of as a mixture between, you know, Oxford and Hogwarts. It's this sort of amazing sort of medieval place ringed by the River Dart with these amazing oak trees all over it. And yeah, it's a lovely place where people, you know, are studying this stuff, and there's a real attempt to bridge academia and other ways of knowing and being in the world, and, you know, and the transition that needs to happen. And anyway, whilst I was there, you know, one of the things I learned is that many indigenous people, you know, if you if one were to say, so, who are you? Rather than saying what I said at the beginning of my talk, when you asked me that, well, I'm a therapist, and and this is my experience. They will introduce themselves within the context of the place that they live and the tribe that they're part of.
Wow.
And so there's a completely different sense of identity. It's actually linked to the physical place that they come from. And that's why so many indigenous populations are so, amongst other reasons, are so profoundly traumatized, is because the ground of their understanding of who they are has been taken away.
Yeah.
They've been displaced.
Yeah.
And and so within eco-psychology and our thinking now, there's a term for this. This is the ecological self. And the more that we can identify with the natural world and the many other beings around us that are not only human, the more that we have a sense of belonging.
Yep.
Which of course is curative.
Yes.
The more that we feel a sense of empathy for the world around us and what we're doing to it, and the more motivated we are to actually be in relationship, rather than it being this exploitative and extractive kind of transaction from the natural world. It's actually a being that we're in relationship with and we respect.
Yeah.
So that's I could go off on a rant about that, and I won't.
Well, I'm just wondering. I'm wondering if for you, what were some of the benefits of taking this eco-psychology route or the nature route, or what you see for your clients. I'm mindful for our trauma audience and the guys watching, for them, what they can do in their own journey and how beneficial seeing things as a collective, or dare I even say from a soul identity, that we are all interconnected and connected, how it's going to help them and their own traumatized parts, I guess.
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons I was so drawn to this perspective is because for me, it fills in a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle, which is, if we're therapists or just healing people and we're trying to heal and we're trying to live an effective and meaningful and useful life, what does it mean if the society that we're attempting to adapt to and we're attempting to help others adapt to is in fact not operating in our best interests? So because of that dysfunction that we've talked about, that separation consciousness that's not aware of the whole of itself, and a little bit like a split off part from the individual, that we try and just sort of push into the corner or we try and ignore, but is always coming back. And actually a part of us knows that and is in distress about that and has all of these coping mechanisms to keep, at bay. And so for me, this healing can't actually happen without this other dimension being acknowledged and being started to be healed. So that's the first piece, because for me, I was confused. Why can't I just sort of get on with business as usual? Why can't I just get a nice job and settle down and sort of have the kids. I mean, they do have kids now, but in a way that sort of made sense perhaps to the more mainstream sort of perspective on life. And I think it's because a part of me knew that there's something out of balance here, and what I'd be adapting to wouldn't actually be in the service of the whole. And so for me it was very healing and very helpful to have that understanding validated and affirmed. It's like, there's something not right, there's something not happening, there's something that doesn't feel right, even though I'm like, I've got a great understanding of where my stuff comes from, I've got a brilliant mindfulness practice, I'm helping other people, I've got a meaningful job, but there's something not right. And so that was helpful. And I think there are a lot of us, I think, are suffering with that on some level, whether it's conscious or unconscious. There's a sense of dis-ease about the disconnection between what we know is happening on a collective level, and the direction that we're going in, and our well-being. So that's the sort of backdrop piece. On a more kind of practical level, we all know it. Going for a walk in the woods or going to the park makes us feel better.
Yeah.
And there are physiological reasons for that. There's microbes that we come into contact with in the soil if we're doing a bit of gardening. There's the quality of the air that we breathe when we're in the forests. The studies are being done more and more to sort of try and actually identify what is happening on a kind of practical level here. But so there's that physiological response. There's the soothing of the nervous system.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah.
It's absolutely huge.
That hugging a tree stuff, I mean, it really does make a difference.
It really does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Walking barefoot.
Yeah.
Just feeling the earth, underneath your toes.
Yeah.
And for me, there's a bit of a craze now, isn't there, about wild swimming, which, I love the idea of wild swimming. Like a generation ago, it was just simply called swimming. That's a sign, of where we're at as a collective. But, there's something about kind of actually bringing the body into contact with the real world.
Yes.
That stimulates some kind of restorative process within our whole system. And so nature-based mindfulness, has become a big thing. And I mean, you only need to open Calm now and you're flooded with bird song or, swooshing waves or whatever it is. And, there are psychoevolutionary reasons for why that is actually impacting us beneficially.
Yeah.
It's easy to forget that, only 200 years ago, we didn't have electric light. We didn't have roads. We were living in a completely different context.
Yeah.
And only 10,000 years ago, which in evolutionary terms is a blink of the eye, we were like profoundly and intricately connected with our environment. So our bodies are hungry for that regulation, because that's what they know. Our circadian rhythms, it's embedded in nature.
Yeah.
So
being woken up with the light, going to sleep when it's dark,
exactly, those simple
smells,
things.
Yeah.
And they say that it only takes 3 days and 3 nights for us, if we go into a nature environment and we kind of unplug, to actually start to kind of reconnect with that deeper knowing, with that sense of settling in our whole systems.
Beautiful. So. Yeah, I'm having a lovely memory at the moment of an island in the Philippines that I stayed in a very open cabin. It just had nets in the middle of the forest for a couple of weeks, a while ago. But oh my God, that was just the most incredible experience, sleeping there every night. I did have a mosquito net though.
nothing wrong with a bit of
a little bit being looked after. So Freddie, where now for this? Where now for Ecos? How do you feel it fitting in, both in the general kind of therapy movement or also in the kind of trauma field? How do you see this developing? Because I get about the collective soup and I get about the macro affecting the micro, and I hear that, especially with everything that's going on in the world now as we record this interview, in times of strife and trouble, and we've just overcome COVID. Well, we haven't yet, but we've had a world pandemic. We've got the climate change. We've got the terrible atrocities that we're witnessing in Ukraine, and our fellows and friends there. So the collective soup, if you like, is very activated all the time, and the trauma is being, unfortunately, you know, recycled or recirculated down. And I know that many of us feel probably that we want to stop what's out there, and we want to be in situations or environments. I know that I yearn for being on top of a mountain and just being able to see green fields. But I wonder if we can't do that at the moment, and we're just mindful and we're opening up to it, and we can get out in nature as much as we can and smell the earth and be in it, how we can look after the micro within us. Because even if we can't do it the other way round, maybe we can still attend to those traumatized aspects of ourself and ground ourselves somehow. Does that make any sense? It's a bit of a long ramble, but
no, it makes huge sense, and it's a great question, a very important one. And I just want to say that you know, introducing these bigger themes, I understand, you know, is potentially challenging, you know, and triggering. It's a huge question to sit with and start to kind of confront. And so, like everything else, you know, in our healing journeys, it can only be done according to the capacity that we have to engage and digest and integrate. And so we have to put that first, and we have to prioritize our own emotional needs at the time. And so, you know, I'm not suggesting that anyone's kind of, you know, tries to run with this before they can walk. You know, this is about right now just getting a sense of how supportive the natural world can be, you know, in our own healing. And so, I mean, the way that it's developing is more and more, I think, you know, the NHS and the kind of support structures and systems that are recognizing that it's a win-win for everybody. It's like, it's good for your physical health. It's not so costly as, like, you know, medication or therapy. So helping people get outdoors and just do stuff and engage is going to become huge. You know, it's already starting. And you know, kind of social prescribing type stuff. And and you know, there are training organizations sort of growing up around the place. There's one called Natural Academy, which is where I've done my training, which I really love, based near Bristol. They're sort of branching out. You know, there's all sorts of ways of accessing this. You don't have to find a specifically nature-based psychotherapist or ecotherapist or ecopsychologist or whatever you might call it. And, you know, the names are all a bit interchangeable at the moment because it's such an emergent field that, you know, we're just kind of finding our way with it. But, you know, there's everything from, as I say, nature-based mindfulness, and walk and talk type therapy, you know, just meeting up with someone, going for a walk. More and more therapists are actually offering
that. And we're doing it quite a lot, and I've seen it a lot in the EMDR community, because of course walking is another form of bilateral stimulation.
Absolutely.
So it does exactly the same as, you know, you process as you walk.
That's so fantastic. I realized that. Great. You know, there's sort of wilderness and bushcraft courses which are sort of reviving all over the place. And there's horticultural therapy, which is becoming bigger and bigger. There's an amazing book by a woman called Sue Stewart Smith called The Well-Gardened Mind. She's a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, who's an avid gardener, and her husband is like an amazing, you know, sort of award-winning garden designer and things. And she writes so beautifully about it. And,
lovely.
you know, goes into a lot of studies and so on. and more within hospitals and, you know, health contexts, it's trying to be brought back in.
Brilliant.
But in terms of, you know, if anyone's listening to this who doesn't have the, you know, the luck of having nature on your doorstep, and I understand that that's the majority of us, there's a lot we can do.
Yeah.
You know, even if we're in a high-rise building, to actually start orienting towards the natural world, and you know, be that positioning ourselves somewhere, you know, by a window where we have a little bit of a vista, or we can see the sky, or we can see, you know, that green life outside, and spending a bit of time, you know, in a kind of contemplative, mindful way.
Yeah.
If we can, moving into using the senses to connect with nature. So, you know, going up to that pot plant that you've got, you know, that sort of sits there neglected by the door or whatever, you know, and going and feeling the leaves and just rubbing them through the fingertips, and just actually really considering what this means. There is this thing growing, you know, without you doing anything apart from just giving it a bit of water every once in a while. And and if we go out into nature, obviously that can happen on a sort of deeper and more embodied level. Something else that's really helpful to bear in mind when we're in more of an urban environment is that all the materials that have been used to create those structures, the man-made structures around us, come from the earth.
Yeah.
Everything comes from the earth. And so we are surrounded by it, you know, even if we can't immediately recognize it.
Yeah.
Another beautiful thing to do is to go out into nature when you do get a chance to go for a walk, or, you know, along a river or wherever it is, and just to notice what you're drawn to. So maybe there's a question that you're mulling over in your mind, there's a bit of a dilemma or something that's really bothering you, or, you know, perhaps a piece of your own healing that you're working with at that time. And just notice what you feel drawn to, you know, be it a stick that's lying in a funny direction across the thing, or a sort of little pebble that catches your attention, or, you know, the flight of a bird across the sky and into that little sort of thicket, you know, and just allowing ourselves to be curious and to actually allow ourselves to be distracted. And it's entering into that soft focus instead of the kind of more, you know, left brain kind of hyper vigilant focus that we're in so much of the time, you know, at the moment. There's just so much vying for our attention all the time. But if we just step out of that and we just let that soft focus be there, it's like we become available to be touched and affected by the world around us and the environment around us, instead of having to be in the driver's seat.
Beautiful, beautiful. And even beautiful looking out behind you, you know, and seeing, I don't know where the sunset will be, or whether it's just so, stunning to be able to witness that. So could you just say, or maybe at the end, Freddie, just say how people can get in touch with you and what you're doing now in Devon, and a bit more about your retreats and everything else that I know that you're offering. And also because I need to come down still.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
You can come and stay in this very cabin.
Amazing. Yes, please.
All yours.
Yeah, it looks amazing.
So, well, what I'm doing now is I've got my conventional practice, which still continues in Totnes in South Devon, and and I also work as part of Right to Freedom, which is this wonderful organization which we take recovering addicts up onto Dartmoor, and we have a kind of rite of passage immersion experience that lasts for a couple of days. That's really beautiful.
Oh, that sounds incredible. I didn't know you did that. They sound amazing.
It's really good. I'm actually going to put together a kind of list of resources and put it up on my website. I'll ping you a link to
Yeah,
it.
yeah, do. That sounds brilliant.
So I'll put their details on there. And so, you know, I live in this place about 15 minutes outside of Totnes, which is it's a little valley called the Ashwell Valley, and we're part of the Greater Dart watershed, and flow into the Dart River, which is just this magical place. And it's a very it's very holding. It's a very sweet landscape around here, which is exactly what I need. And I needed for my whole system to be able to kind of settle and open and feel that safety, you know, within myself.
Beautiful.
And so we offer retreats here. We offer solo retreats where people can come and stay. They can just do their own thing and kind of immerse in nature if they want to. They can have a bit of input from me if they want to, and we can kind of work out, you know, what their needs are and do some kind of therapeutic journey if that's needed or wanted.
Amazing.
And we're running a retreat at the end of April, towards the end of April, which is called Evoking Wholeness.
Okay, amazing. Who's that going to be for?
It's with a specific focus on helping us work with our avoidant and escapist patterns. You know, because hey, you can take the drugs out of the addict, but that impulse may well remain. And so we're going to be introducing nature-based practices to work with this stuff, and really looking at honoring those escapist parts of ourselves for the job that they've done. You know? And developing self-compassion even more deeply than maybe we've done before, and developing that ecological self so that we can feel part of the wider context.
Sounds brilliant.
You know, for me, eventually there's a real desire to support people to understand that, you know, when we've got these mechanisms, these coping strategies in place, which can be so destructive and so painful, but that underneath them there is a very often incredibly intelligent and sacred, almost, you know, impulse, which once we get to that point of recovery where we're able to regain some regulation, regain some agency, can actually become the most beautiful offering into the world. And I guess that's my sort of message of hope, is that, you know, if we do understand ourselves as part of this greater system, then and our own individual dysfunctions as part of the dysfunction of the greater system, then our own individual wholeness and our individual wellness can offer into and support the holding of, you know, this greater system that we're a part of. And I think it's essential. I think we've each got a part to play in that, and can do that. And you know, that's what I want, is to support people to be able to step into that place as much as possible.
I'm totally with you. That's my belief system as well, maybe in a different way or a different aspect, but I remember in my training a long time ago, there was a very wise family therapist in America who touched me, called Virginia Satir.
Oh yes. Yeah.
And she wrote it was a great book for anybody listening to this, called The New People Making, and really talking about, you know, for us and our children and the next generation and those around us, whether they be human beings or whether they be animals or whether they be plants or whether they be the birds. You know, I was thinking of the birds that I feed every day outside. You know, in my own way, that's my attempt to connect to nature, because I don't mind what the birds are. I don't mind what type of birds they are, because they're all God's creatures. We're all God's creatures, aren't we? But I like to think the more we lighten up our own internal parts, and the more connected we become to those parts of ourselves that maybe we've disconnected from, the more availability we have to then put out there in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that in, Lou, because you know what I'm presenting is, again, it's just that one particular lens that has made so much sense to me and supported my own journey so much. But I understand that it's different for everyone, and we've each got our orientation. And it's so important to honor and respect that.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to there is an interesting piece about that I found really helpful. I don't know if it is necessary to say this, but for me, introducing the kind of nature connection piece has got a different flavor to it than the spiritual sort of transcendent spirituality piece. That makes
it makes total sense.
Great. And there was a real turning point for me, actually.
Yeah.
I didn't describe this. It was a bit later on in the journey where I went from kind of knowing that the mindfulness had taken me so far, and it had, you know, been huge and remains huge, but there was something else that I was yearning for again. And I came across this book called Soulcraft by Bill Plotkin. And in it, he describes how our culture, the Western culture, you know, is primarily oriented towards the transcendent spiritual impulse.
Yes.
It's about union consciousness. It's about bliss.
Yes.
It's about, you know, like getting away from it all and feeling great. And that's it, you know, i.e. spiritual bypassing.
Yeah.
And,
exactly.
you know, and that is, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking it. It's like, that is,
I'm knocking the spiritual bypassing. Don't worry. I'll come up on that one and go, please don't spiritually bypass.
Yeah. So what he said is that there's this whole, so if we see it as on a pole, spirituality is on a pole, we've got the upward dimension, which is the union consciousness.
Yeah.
But we've also got the downward dimension, which is all about kind of embodiment and nature and form rather than thought. And the way that we do that, you know, is to actually really embrace our individuality and our uniqueness and our messy animal humanity, you know. So yeah,
I love that. What was his name?
Bill Plotkin.
I'm going to write that down. I agree with Bill.
He's a total dude.
Yeah. I think that any other form of connection up personally that doesn't come through the body and isn't embodied doesn't feel like it has the, what's that I want to, it
doesn't have the sort of sustenance
or the substance or the grounding or the energetic solidity. To me, it's all a bit too I was going to say wishy-washy, and then I thought, no, you best not say that.
But yeah, it's very much more in the conceptual, and it's not grounded.
Yeah, and we know, us trauma survivors, thrivers, that we need to come through the body. We need to ground through the body. However we do that, it's got to be of body, because body mind is where it's at. And you found a brilliant and beautiful and path for you that totally works, and I'm sure would work for a lot of other people too.
Yeah, well, if anyone feels drawn to exploring it, there's a lot more stuff out there, and I'll just tell you my website so that, you know, that information will be there.
And I'll put it as well under the link. I'll put your website under the link in the Facebook group too.
Brilliant. Well, it's www.thehearthdevon.com,
Brilliant.
And my sort of more conventional counselling website is www.freddyweaver@yahoo.co.uk. And no, Freddy. Sorry. No,
without the Yahoo. Without
it's
the Yahoo.
freddyweaver.co.uk.
Yes, I was going to say, yeah, I thought it might be. Listen, it's rolling on a bit. Have the kids gone to bed without you tonight, or are they waiting up for Daddy to finish the
with any luck, they shall be fast asleep, and I will have a nice, relaxed evening ahead of me.
Oh,
It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been lovely. And guys, whoever's watching or listening now, thank you for joining us. Honestly, it's great to have you with us. And for those of you watching later, Freddie is in the group. So I'm sure if anybody wants to ask you something, he can check back in maybe later in the week. And yeah, let us know your thoughts. Let us know your feelings about it. We'd be interested to hear what you guys have got to say. In the meantime, Freddie, lovely to see you. Really great to catch up. And I shall be down there in Devon soon. And we'll say goodbye to you guys. Take care. Lots of love. And we'll be back next week. Well, Freddie won't be back, but I will be. All right. Bye-bye. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to today's podcast. I hope it helped you in some way, and I really hope to see you back here soon. If you have anything to share on today's experience or podcast, please nip over to the YouTube channel or the Facebook group Trauma Thrivers and let us know there.